Picture this. You spend your whole life trying to fit in. You model your speech, your clothes, your choices, all in search of approval. You bend to expectations that aren't even yours, and little by little you distance yourself from who you really are. You fear being judged. You seek validation in looks that change with each season, and cling to the idea that your value depends on how the world sees you. But what if everything you've been taught about caring too much is actually true? What's stopping you from living? What if the key to confidence, freedom, and even success lies not in control, but precisely in letting go of control? Michel de Montaigne, a 10th century thinker, explored this paradox in depth. While the world around him collapsed in wars, he retreated to a silent tower, not to escape, but to observe the human soul. His essays did not seek to indoctrinate, but to liberate, and his philosophy, far from being abstract, is a compass for those who wish to live with lightness, authenticity, and inner peace. Montaigne challenged what we mean by success, questioned the need to please, and pointed out a path to serenity, detachment. In this video, we're going to walk that path. We're going to look at the anxiety of pleasing, the fear of failure, the addiction to control. And with Montaigne as our guide, we'll discover what happens when you simply stop caring about what never really mattered. From an early age, we are taught to believe that if we control everything, we will be safe. Safe from error, judgment, and failure. As if life were an exact equation and all it took was effort, planning, and worry to keep everything in order. But Montaigne, observing the human condition with serene eyes and without illusions, saw something that few have the courage to admit. Control is, more often than not, a fantasy. We live in a constant attempt to control the uncontrollable, what others think, what might happen, how we will be perceived. And in this Herculean effort, we waste our most vital energy, which could be directed towards creation, presence, and love. Montaigne almost died in a horse-riding accident, and this experience confronted him with the absolute fragility of life. He understood that no amount of planning, no amount of caution, no amount of obsessive worrying could have saved him from that accident. And paradoxically, it was at that moment that something lit up in his soul. To live is not to control. To live is to accept the flow. He wrote, "My life has been full of terrible misfortunes, most of which never happened." This simple sentence disarms an entire modern mentality. How many anxieties do you carry around because of scenarios that never materialized? How many nights have you wasted trying to predict the future or correct the past? How many dialogues have you rehearsed in your mind, hoping to control reactions that never came? The truth is that striving for control takes us away from reality, prevents us from listening to what life is saying right now. And ironically, the more we try to hold the reins, the more unstable everything seems to become. Montaigne invites us to look at this obsession with tenderness and then gently let it go. Because life, in its essence, is not a machine to be operated. It is a living organism, full of surprises and only flourishes for those who have the courage to dance with the unpredictable. There is an invisible force that silently guides many of our steps, the desire to be accepted. Since childhood, we have learned that approval is a reward, a look of pride, a compliment, a nod of belonging. And so, little by little, we start to build our identity around what pleases others. But Michel de Montaigne observed with cutting precision that this path leads to an inner labyrinth, because when we live for the acceptance of others, we lose touch with what is truly ours. He wrote to understand himself, not to convince. He wasn't looking for applause, but for authenticity. And perhaps that's why his texts resonate so deeply to this day, because Montaigne had the rare courage to think for himself in a world that was screaming for conformity. The search for validation is subtle, almost imperceptible. It's in the choice of clothing, in the omission of an opinion, in the constant adaptation to the environment. We don't want to be a nuisance, we don't want to disappoint, but by avoiding the other person's discomfort, we put ourselves in a prison. And the most tragic thing is that this validation, when it finally comes, doesn't satisfy us because it wasn't directed at our true self, but the mask we put on to be accepted. Montaigne proposes another way, that of knowing oneself so well of accepting oneself so fully that the opinion of others loses its power to hurt or shape. He invites us to ask ourselves, who are you trying to please and why? How many decisions in your life, professional, emotional, or existential, have been made out of fear of judgment and not out of true desire? When you stop looking for acceptance, everywhere you discover something rare and precious, self-acceptance. And from then on, relationships become more honest, decisions lighter, and life more quietly yours. Contrary to what many people think, detachment is not coldness, indifference, apathy, or running away from life. Detachment is clarity. It's the wisdom to distinguish between what deserves our energy and what just consumes us. It's knowing how to let go, not because we don't care, but because it's no longer worth holding on to. Montaigne understood this paradox in depth. He observed how people lived attached to results, expectations, and idealized images of themselves, and how this created a constant tension, a corrosive anxiety. He didn't propose giving up on life, on the contrary, but rather living lightly, acting with dedication but without obsession, loving without possessiveness, searching without getting lost along the way. In his retreat, Montaigne wrote, "Not out of obligation but out of curiosity, not to be recognized but to understand oneself." And it is in this space of compulsive non-effort, in this creative emptiness, that the soul flourishes. How many times in your life have you achieved something precisely when you stopped forcing it? When you stopped trying to convince, impress, or conquer? It's as if the universe responds to surrender with harmony. This is the paradox of detachment. The less you need to prove yourself, the more natural your presence becomes. The less you try to control, the more things align themselves. And it's not luck, it's presence. It's coherence between what you feel, think, and do. It's the magnetism of someone who doesn't beg for acceptance because they've already found a home within themselves. Montaigne teaches us that detachment is actually a form of power, a serene, silent power that doesn't impose but transforms. When you let go of the weight of pleasing, of controlling, of looking perfect, you become light enough to walk freely and firm enough to be who you really are. Montaigne was neither an asceta nor a tragic hero. He was a man deeply aware of his shortcomings, and perhaps that's why he was so wise. He lived through significant losses, the death of 5 of his 6 children in infancy, the early death of his best friend Etienne de la Boétie, and the political and social collapse of a France in civil war. Pain and disappointment didn't make him cynical, they made him more real. Instead of hardening, he chose to withdraw, left politics, distanced himself from positions of power, and retired to his tower, a space of silence, books, and meditation. There, between the wooden corridors and the Latin phrases inscribed on the ceiling of his library, he began what he would call the study of himself, not to exalt himself, but to accept himself. In his essays, Montaigne exposes his soul with a rare honesty. He confesses his vanities, his weaknesses, his fears, and his inconsistencies, and it is precisely this vulnerability that makes him universal. He wrote, "I don't portray myself entirely, only as I see myself at this moment." This phrase carries a liberating truth. No one is constant, no one is perfect, and everything is in motion. To accept this is to abandon the armor. It's to stop playing an ideal version of yourself in order to finally inhabit your own humanity. In today's world, where everyone seems to be competing for an image of success, coherence, and perfection, Montaigne emerges as an antidote. He reminds us that to be human is to contradict oneself, that changing one's mind is a sign of inner life, and that accepting imperfection doesn't weaken us, it frees us. When you stop demanding an unattainable ideal of yourself, you allow the real you to manifest itself, the lightness of error, the beauty of doubt, the peace of simply being. And so Montaigne gives us one of philosophy's most healing lessons. Wisdom is not born of perfection, but of intimacy with one's own imperfection. If there is one area where detachment reveals its true strength, it is in human relationships. Montaigne, with her deep and disillusioned gaze, observed how we become hostages to each other, not out of true love, but out of fear of rejection, of loneliness, of not being enough. How many times have you tried to mold someone into your image? How many times have you been frustrated because the other person didn't live up to an expectation that perhaps you didn't even know existed? The philosopher understood that relational suffering doesn't arise from the difference between people, but from our attempt to control, restrain, correct. In his work, he wrote tenderly about his friendship with Laboissy, a connection that didn't demand, that didn't charge, it just was. A friendship free of possessiveness, it was a revelation to the Montenegrin of what is possible when you love someone without trying to possess them. It offers us a rare ideal. Relationships based on presence, not demands, on surrender, not domination. And here's the paradox. The more you try to hold on to someone, the more they escape. But the more you allow the other person to be, the more they choose to remain. Freedom in relationships doesn't mean the absence of a bond, but the refusal to turn the other person into a mirror of your insecurities. Montaigne teaches us that the true encounter between two souls happens when both walk side by side, not out of obligation, but by choice. And this freedom is magnetic. It generates respect, admiration, and depth. It attracts not by force, but by lightness, not by control, but by authenticity. Ask yourself, how many of your relationships are based on the fear of losing rather than the joy of sharing? The answer may hurt, but it can also set you free. There is a silent, almost imperceptible moment when something inside us just lets go. It's not giving up. It's not weakness. It's a kind of wisdom that doesn't come from reason, but from a sacred exhaustion. It's the moment when you realize that you can't control everything, that you don't have to prove yourself all the time, that carrying around so many worries doesn't make any sense. Montaigne knew this moment well, and it is from it that his philosophy flourishes. Surrender not as renunciation, but as reconciliation with life. He didn't propose passivity, but an action free of anguish, a life engaged but free of guarantees. He understood that there is a profound peace that only arises when we stop resisting the impermanence of the world. And this peace is revolutionary, because when you let go of control, you become lighter, and with this lightness you see better, act more clearly, and become receptive to the unexpected. What happens when you stop caring what other people think? You speak more truthfully. What happens when you stop looking for perfection? You act with more courage, and when you let go of the fear of failure, you make room to create, to love, to live. Surrendering to the mountain wasn't escape, it was presence. It was to stop fighting reality and start dancing with it. And herein lies the greatest paradox of all. The less you try to control life, the more it starts to align itself. Perhaps because in this state of surrender you finally become who you are, the world responds to this truth with harmony. Montaigne left us a silent legacy, not of rules, formulas, or certainties, but of a more whole presence in the face of life. He taught us that the obsession with control is the opposite of freedom, that the constant effort to please others is the greatest enemy of authenticity, and that the fear of failure is often the only real obstacle between us and what we want to live. Throughout this journey, we've seen that letting go isn't abandonment, it's trust. It's stepping off center stage and allowing life to reveal its choreography. And here lies the most beautiful mystery of all. When you stop caring about what doesn't matter, what does matter begins to blossom. When you let go of fear, courage comes. When you let go of the need to prove, comes the silent power of simply being. Montaigne doesn't ask us to change the world. It invites us to change the way we inhabit ourselves. And when that happens, the world around us changes too. And you? What are you still holding on to so tightly that it's already starting to hurt? You? What might happen if you just let go for a moment? Share in the comments an experience you've had with letting go. Perhaps by telling your story, you'll help others. Subscribe.